Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov calls the G20 summit in India a success. Adds that countries of the global south helped manage to ensure the G20 agenda was not overshadowed by the Ukraine conflict. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva says it will be up to Brazil's judiciary to decide whether Russian President Vladimir Putin will be arrested if he attends the next year's G20 summit in the South American country. Plus, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Russian President Vladimir Putin has already lost in what he was trying to achieve. Thank you for being with us this morning. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov called the G20 summit in India a success and says that due to the consolidated position of the countries of the global south, Russia managed to ensure the agenda was not overshadowed by the Ukraine conflict. The Group of 20 adopted a consensus declaration at a summit on Saturday that avoided condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine, but called on all states not to use force to grab territory. Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine has left tens of thousands of people dead, displaced millions of people, and sown economic turmoil across the world. Moscow, which says it is conducting a special military operation, denies committing any atrocities. Mr. Lavrov also says that Russia was willing to return to the Black Sea grain deal as soon as its conditions are met. Russia quit the deal in July, a year after it was brokered by the United Nations and Turkey, complaining that its own food and fertilizer exports faced obstacles and insufficient Ukrainian grain was going to countries in need. He added that Russia values the attempts by the United Nations to facilitate the grain talks, but called it West-only talks. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov also announced that India plans to propose various investment options for the billions of rupees that Russia has amassed from its exports. Mr. Lavrov made the announcement at the G20 summit, indicating that Moscow and New Delhi are constantly in touch with each other on the bilateral matter, including the payment issues, according to the minister. The Russian Foreign Minister also says in his words, "I have recently met with my counterpart, and discussed bilateral issues, including the issue of trade settlement. In the current situation, Russia has billions of rupees accumulated in the accounts of Indian banks, and we are discussing how they can be used. And our Indian friends have conveyed they will suggest promising areas where these funds can be used as investment." Mr. Lavrov noted that other bilateral agreements, including in the defense sector, are progressing as planned, despite difficulty with payments caused by the sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies. Still at the G20 summit, this time French President Emmanuel Macron says meeting which was founded to solve international economic rather than political issues was not necessarily the place to expect diplomatic progress on the war in Ukraine. But he added that G20 leaders' declaration at the weekend meeting was not a diplomatic victory for Russia, which emerged isolated from the summit, according to some. Speaking at the ceremony, Mr. Macron told the press conference, in his words, "This G20 confirms once again the isolation of Russia. Yesterday and today, an overwhelming majority of G20 members condemned the war in Ukraine and its impact." But for Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva at the G20 summit, it will be up to Brazil's judiciary to decide whether Russian President Vladimir Putin will be arrested if he attends next year's summit in the South American country. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for him in March, accusing him of the war crime of illegally deporting hundreds of children from Ukraine. However, Russia has denied its forces have engaged in war crimes or forcibly taken Ukrainian children. Mr. Lula told reporters in the Indian capital, New Delhi, where he was attending the G20 summit over the weekend, that if Putin decides to join, it's the judiciary's powers to decide and not my government. Away from the G20 summit to the battlefield in Ukraine now, where Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says Ukrainian troops pressing a counter-offensive against Russian occupying forces have advanced on the southern front in the past week, while there had also been movement near Bakhmut in the east. In his usual nightly video address, Mr. Zelensky confirmed that a Russian attack on a car of volunteers killed a Canadian citizen identified as Anthony Ignat and offered his condolences to the family. He adds that a German and Swedish national were also injured in the attack.
Over the past 7 days, we have made advances in the Tavrian directions. There is a movement in the Bakhmut direction. Also near the town of Chasiv Yar in Donetsk region, Russian terrorists attacked a car of volunteers. Direct hits from an anti-tank missile system. As of now, we know for sure that Canadian citizen Anthony Ignat was killed. Unfortunately, the Spanish citizen Emma Igual is also probably dead. My condolences to the families. 2 more volunteers were taken to Dnipro hospitals.
President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says Russian President Vladimir Putin has already lost in what he was trying to achieve. It comes as Mr. Blinken's recent visit to Ukraine on Wednesday was overshadowed by a Russian attack that killed at least 17 people. Mr. Blinken, the first top U.S. official to visit Kyiv since the counteroffensive began in early June, announced a new package of U.S. wartime assistance worth more than $1 billion, including support for Ukraine's air defense system.
And keep in mind, Putin has already lost in what he was trying to achieve. He was trying to erase Ukraine from the map and its independence, subsume it into Russia. That has already been a failure. Now, where exactly this settles, where lines are drawn, that is going to be up to Ukrainians. But I've found a strong determination to continue to work to get their territory back that's been seized by Russia. And as to negotiations, John, it takes 2 to tango. Sure. And thus far, we see no indication that Vladimir Putin has any interest in meaningful diplomacy. If he does, I think the Ukrainians will be the first to engage, and we'll be right behind them. Everyone wants this war to end, but it has to end on just terms and on durable terms that reflect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We haven't encouraged and we haven't enabled any use of weapons outside of Ukraine's territory. Having said that, let's take a step back for a second. Virtually every single day, the Russians are attacking indiscriminately throughout the entire country of Ukraine. Just during the 48 hours that I was there, going in, more missiles were launched at civilian targets, including in Kyiv. While I was there, a horrific attack on a marketplace. People just going to buy food. Civilians had nothing to do with this war. Killed 17 people. This is the daily life for Ukrainians. This is what they face every single day. So they have to make the basic decisions about how they're going to defend their territory and how they're working to take back what's been seized from them. Our role, the role of dozens of other countries around the world that are supporting them, is to help them do that. And ultimately, what we all want is an end to this Russian aggression, and an end to the aggression that, again, is just and is durable. That's what Ukrainians want more than anyone else. That's what we're working toward. It's very clear in the room, going around the table, that countries are feeling the consequences and want the Russian aggression to stop. And I think the statement reflects the strong support that virtually every country in the G20 has for Ukraine and its territorial integrity and sovereignty.
U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Now let's talk to Dr. Ambrose Iwoke, the chairman, Guild of Public Affairs and Analysts in Enugu State Chapter. Welcome to the program this morning. Thank you for being with us.
Good morning, Olumide. Thanks for being here.
While the G20 summit leaders of the free world were meeting in New Delhi, the soldiers of Ukraine and Russia were fighting on the front lines of the war in Ukraine. At the end of that meeting, the document released was consensus, did not put the blame at the door of Russia. It excluded that, and because of that, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergey Lavrov, seemed to be beaming with some sort of approval, while French President Emmanuel Macron was lessening the impact of that paper that came out as a consensus, even though hardline Ukrainian supporters like the UK, and America and France were members and were present at that summit. Who came out on top, if that can be used as a sort of outcome of this meeting?
I like your question, because actually it's a contest between the West and the rest of the world. There was a phrase you used at the beginning, which I have reservations about. You said the rest of the free world was meeting. I don't know the word that is on bondage, because these are Western media cliches to describe the West, that the West is free and the rest of us are in bondage, which I don't think is a correct narrative. When in communication, the international free flow of information is not there. So in India, once again, the world showed that the problem between Russia and Ukraine is sectional. That the problem between both countries are actually some issues between, first of all, two neighbors, two fraternal neighbors, not just neighbors with long stretch of history. And then the world has also shown that there is a hand of Esau in some of these things happening. Ukraine being backed by France, by United States, by England, Germany, basically European Union and the United States. And then Russia also having being friends with India, with China, with Japan. Turkey is playing, host. But again, China and India has been strong behind, Russia. And again, Lavrov should be able to smile, because the West, was pushing for a very definitive statement in that G20 summit to condemn Russia and bring the war of Ukraine to the fore. But the other members of the G20 told a more subtle line, a more mediative approach, and said that the war, that they were in India not to discuss the war in Ukraine, but to discuss economic issues, because G20 is about economic issues and not political or regional fratricidal wars. And that was made clear to the West. And the West had to agree to that consensus. When you check out the communique and the statements that came from the G20, you find out that it was kind of watered down, very watered down in my own opinion. There was no strong statements about the war. They just said that there's a consensus in the fact that external invasion of sovereign countries should not be tolerated. And so it didn't call Russia, it didn't call Ukraine. And for me, that was really not a watershed statement. It was just a statement that was made to please the West, just to say something. But at the same time, it was not something definitive. So it's not a win for Russia. It's more a win for Russia, I would rather say, because the meeting did not condemn Russia's aggression on Ukraine as the West wanted it to be. So Lavrov is correct. On the other hand, Macron, of course, has to save face, because it didn't go as the West planned it. And all the same, whatever is being done around the world should be geared at ending the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and not ego-tripping, as was seen in the G20 summit.
Is this an indication of things to come? Because it took some as by surprise that it didn't become front and center in that meeting, and that there actually was consensus. Is this a pointer that other nations, especially the global south, will in future meetings such as this begin to lessen the global importance of the conflict in Ukraine?
Already the world has moved on. And basically, what happens in wars is that if you listen to those who beat the drum beats of war and go into war, chances are that after like a year or so, the people who pushed into the war will get tired of the war and move on to other places and move on to other issues, because it's a global world. which is a global community. Issues that affect Africa, affect the West, affect the East, affect everybody. Things that happen. Look at it, COVID-19 that started in Wuhan in China. It became a global threat, and it affected the global economy, and every country was shut down. So that goes to testify how the world has become a very small village in where we live in. Therefore, when things happen in Russia and going on, the world has other issues to attend to. In Africa, for example, we have been grappling with the issues of coup plotting, trying to stabilize the continent, trying to stem the tide of coups and restore democracy. There's the issue of farming in Kenya. We are battling with the issue of poor economic growth in Nigeria. Different countries have their own problems. America is also battling with its own issues. Same with Britain. Same with Germany. Same with France. France are having issues. Look at the problems it's having in Francophone countries in West Africa as well, and the whole of Africa. So people start to treat their own issues and leave it behind to test the bitterness of the war you pushed yourself into. Because for me, I felt that the war between Russia and Ukraine is totally unnecessary. And it would not have gone this far if not by the push from the West to have the Ukraine have a recalcitrant stand in joining NATO. These are things Ukraine would have discussed with Russia and see a way to, after all, some former Soviet countries have joined NATO. So the world has moved on, and Ukraine would be, Ukraine-Russia conflict will be less and less topics for discussion as the world go forward, because we're entering winter now. There are budgets, there are economic decisions to be made about 2024. There are projections to make. The world is having meetings. They are brokering deals, having multilateral and bilateral agreements and trilateral agreements here and there. So Ukraine is left behind all this. Then the great issue is also the blockage that Russia has started. Russia is now going directly to negotiate deals with African countries. America is also grappling with the issue of they're having proxy war in Sudan with Russia. So it's a gamut of complexities. And then, of course, Ukraine will be left behind. So I think I tend to agree with you to say that Ukraine will be less and less topical issue for when the world meets, because the world has its own problem. And
we do apologize. We are speaking with Dr. Ambrose Igboke, who is back now. Dr. Igboke, we took that on board, what you just said. Now let's turn your attention.
I was saying that.
Right.
I was saying that this is a lesson to all, especially global leaders, that they should not be pushed into unnecessary wars. Especially by proxy, by telling you that we'll stand by you, we'll supply the weapons, we can support you. You look at what Anthony Blinken is talking about, that is left for Ukrainian people to find their own way to survive, why they will give them support. So what kind of support are you giving them? Well, so the Ukrainian people are the people dying. The Russians are also dying. So the casualties of the war is within those entities where the wars have been fought, and not those who are beating the drums of war and saying they will supply you technical aid, they will supply you weapons. Weapons to do what? They will supply you weapons to kill yourselves. And so I think world leaders should be rational, that when you're being pushed to war, you should gauge the consequences of the war and try to avoid it at all means.
The drums of war is an ugly sound, Doctor. At the meeting, the baton of leadership of the G20 summit was passed from Narendra Modi of India to Lula da Silva of Brazil, who said that, initially he said that as long as he's president, if he's president of Brazil, if President Putin decided to attend the G20 summit next year in Brazil, he would not be arrested. But he changed his position later and said that it was up to the judiciary whether or not President Putin will be arrested if he so desired to travel to Brazil for the next G20 summit. Your thoughts?
He said the arrest for Putin was ordered by the International Criminal Court of Justice and the ICC. We can see that that I think Russia is not even part of that. We can see that even the United States is not part of the ICC. And so why? It's because countries that have submitted themselves to the jurisdiction of ICC have, I think, given away their sovereignty. And that's why a country like the United States of America refused to submit itself to ICC. because the president of the United States is answerable to the Americans, and answerable to the oath he swore to his people and his country. So I feel that ICC has outlived its usefulness, if it was ever useful. ICC only targets as weak countries, targets as African countries, targets as Latin American countries, and some other countries where they just bear their fans. But the genocide and atrocities being committed by the West in other countries, the one in Iraq, the one that have been committed in other places, have not, no leader of the West have been arrested. Are we saying all the leaders of the West are saints and other leaders are devils? So I think ICC, any sensible country should just move away from ICC and forget about this International Court of Justice. So as time goes by, ICC, influence will begin to diminish, and I think more countries will pull out from it. For Brazilian president, who is also a member of that convention, to say this kind of statement, I think it's very instructive. I don't think Vladimir Putin will bother to go there so that it doesn't cause an unnecessary global war or global diplomatic war. Because let's take it all in. You cannot arrest Vladimir Putin in wherever he goes to. You cannot. And if you do that, the consequences are very high. So let's forget all these rhetorics and face the reality of global diplomacy. So rather than even go there and cause anything that may escalate a global conflict, he would rather stay in Moscow. So I don't think he should even go. He should still be put in Moscow and send his foreign minister and the rest, except for example, a United Nations General Assembly where the presidents have immunity from being arrested. Other places where it can be picked up, I think it should just avoid it so that we can avoid a global conflict. Because if you pick a Vladimir Putin, there will be global conflict.
Let's turn our attention now, Dr. Igboke, to the state of the counteroffensive in Ukraine. Regardless of what Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said, that the Russians have not met their objectives and they failed in what they wanted to achieve, by the Americans' own submission, the counteroffensive only has a 30-day window before the weather begins to totally impede its progress. And they said that in this 30-day window, starting from maybe yesterday, because of the onslaught of the weather, of the winter, it'll be incredibly difficult for the counteroffensive to continue. So within these 30 days, there has to be either significant progress or what have you, for them to find out whether this counteroffensive has indeed succeeded or failed.
I'm still surprised that just a few days to winter, Ukraine is still talking about counteroffensive. And, it's about
All right, Dr. Igboke, please go on.
Okay, I think the United States of America is far away. Same with many of these countries. They are not in the contiguous areas of the war. So I don't know why, Ukraine is still listening to those kind of talks. By now, there should be negotiation because, for example, winter is coming in. Remember the last winter, which was the first winter of the war. There were no gas to power homes in Europe. There were no. So many of the European countries had to buy gas from the United States of America at 3 times the price of what they were buying from Russia. That is very instructive. That is to show that war in Ukraine is very costly because Russian gas supply has been cut off. Last year also we went back a step backwards towards our progress in carbon emissions, because countries like Germany had to reactivate their coal power plants to be able to fire homes during the winter because of lack of gas from Russia. So we can see that these things have its own consequences in the progress of humanity and Europe as a whole. So something has to be done. It's either Europe goes into negotiation with Russia to see how they can lift the embargo on the Russian gas for the period of the winter, or see what they can do to source also cheap gas from other places. As for the 30 days, counter-offensive, I think this is really, really just rhetoric in the war propaganda. After the 30 days, what happens? You go into winter and the people start suffering. And many will die from cold, from the winter, from the frostbite. There are no enough gas to power the homes. They don't have gas to buy. So who is losing? Both ends are losing. So America can sit comfortably in the up north there and talk, while the people in the West are suffering. It is all about the humanity in this. There should be kind of empathy for the people who are really suffering. Because these people who appear on TV to talk to us, who go to the conventions, are safe. They are tucked away safe. It is the masses of these countries that are really suffering. It is the masses of Europe that will suffer the frostbite, who will not be able to buy gas to power their home for the winter. Humanity first in whatever we are considering, and not this global war rhetoric that is going on.
Indeed, we hope that it resounds around the world. Thank you so much, Dr. Ambrose Ibuokwe, Chairman, Guild of Public Affairs Analysts, Enugu State Chapter, for joining us today. He, like all of us, members of the free world.
Thank you very much. I agree.
After the break, Russian installed official hails success of regional elections in Donetsk. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. This is the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock arrived in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, for a surprise visit today. According to Germany's foreign minister, Ms. Baerbock says Germany is resolutely supporting Ukraine on its efforts to join the European Union. She was quoted as saying the enlargement of the EU is a necessary geopolitical consequence of Russia's war. In the midst of a hail of bombs, in the face of Russia's tanks, Ukraine is confidently and resolutely set out on the road to the European Union. This is German Foreign Minister's fourth visit to Ukraine since Russia launched its war on its Western neighbors more than a year and a half ago. The Russian embassy in Helsinki has urged citizens not to use cars with Russian license plates when visiting Finland, citing EU sanctions that allow the seizure of personal vehicles. A statement by the Russian embassy partly reads, considering the potential risk, we recommend Russian nationals avoid traveling to Finland with cars with Russian license plates. The notice came after the European Commission confirmed that Russians are banned from bringing any vehicles across the bloc's border, even for personal use or short-term tourist trips. German media reported earlier this year that police and customs agents were towing away cars registered in Russia. Recent immigrants to Germany were amongst those who had their property confiscated. Similarly, the Russian embassy in Berlin warned citizens against traveling to Germany, citing the seizure of cars. A Russian vote monitoring group declared a foreign agent by the government says the country's regional elections were not real elections. The co-chair of Golos, Stanislav Andreychuk, says there was widespread falsification of the vote, adding that the Kremlin has also expanded new electoral practices that critics say help in falsifying the results. Some regions are voting over several days, which critics say stretches observers thin, while others will employ an online voting scheme that opposition activists allege was used to illegitimately boost United Russia's vote in the 2021 elections to the lower house of parliament, the State Duma. The Russian vote monitoring group says that his organization had received reports of opposition candidates having been detained and having their cars vandalized. Meanwhile, Russian installed authorities in the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which Moscow unilaterally declared its territory last September, held regional polls that mirror elections being held in Russia. The elections in Russia-controlled areas of Ukraine have been condemned by Kyiv and its allies. In Russia, voters began voting on Friday last week in 3 days of tightly controlled regional and local elections that are likely to be interpreted by authorities as a vote of confidence in President Vladimir Putin. Governors, including Moscow's powerful mayor, are up for election in 21 of Russia's regions from Siberia to the Black Sea coast. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said it was difficult to overstate the importance of the round of elections. Now let's talk to the Associate Professor, Department of International Relations at the Mechnikov National University, Mr. Vladimir Dubovic, joining us from Odessa in Ukraine. Dobro ranko. Thank you for being with us.
Dobro ranko. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with these elections, shall we? Russia says
Sure.
Elections are taking place in the areas they've just seized from Ukraine. Are they credible?
Oh, absolutely not. As far as we are concerned, no elections have taken place, and no right for Russia to conduct these elections in the Ukraine-occupied lands. So it's completely bogus. It's something that we, I think, should only comment quickly, like in one sentence. We just don't recognize it, as we don't recognize the belonging of these lands to Russia. So therefore, for us, nothing changes. We continue to fight back and liberate those lands. Free the people who live there, and then when these lands will be reoccupied and liberated from Russian occupiers, then we're going to have free and fair elections.
If it's bogus, as you say, then who are the people voting? We understand that 70%, according to reports of the participants in that elections, are voting for the Russia party.
Yeah, well, let's say, I mean, who believes those referendums that Russia conducts? I mean, they did one in the March of 2014, and they said it was like 90+% in Crimea, and then they leaked their own internal data on this, and it was like twice lower. And we also know that a lot of people in Crimea didn't vote at all. So in this case, the same thing. You know, it was the well-known Russian Soviet political figure Joseph Stalin, who said it doesn't matter how they count. What matters is how they vote. What matters is how we count. So therefore, I mean, some people did vote, maybe some people didn't. A lot of people left the occupied areas. That's another thing. The areas that Russia currently controls in Ukraine, they're basically deserted because most of the people left, either for Russia, by the way, or mostly for other parts of Ukraine or Europe, because we have 6 to 7 millions of people who are refugees from Ukraine and Europe, and they're mostly from those lands that Russia currently occupies. And the way they do election, imagine the door in this room where I am right now opens, and the guy with a machine gun comes in and says, you have to vote, so put your, I don't know, whatever sign on a piece of paper, and that's your vote. So that's exactly how it's going on. I mean, they've basically been videos over the weekend. They've been coming to the houses, knocking on the doors, sometimes knocking the doors down, and basically forcing people to vote and looking while they're voting. So, I mean, there's no transparency, of course. And if you want to save your life, okay, well, maybe you put your little sign that, okay, fine, I'm fine with, like, whatever they want me to do.
How do you feel about the outcome of the G20 summit, where it was not specifically mentioned that Russia should be condemned for the war in Ukraine in the wording of the consensus documents? Good, bad, or indifferent?
It's a good question, and you got me good choices. I myself personally a bit indifferent. I say that G20 is not necessarily a very powerful, institution these days. We have more groupings from which we depend much more. In Ukraine, for instance, G7, their position is clear, and they're providing a lot of assistance. Part of that organization is, by the way, Japan, which is, of course, not sending weapons to Ukraine, but sending a lot of otherwise very important financial assistance, and working with US and other countries in the region. By the way, since I mentioned Japan, South Korea, Australia, and many others are working with Ukraine very actively, and those that I've mentioned right now actually do send the weapons. So going back to G20, of course, that the year ago, at least in their communique after the Indonesia meeting, they said that the war of Russia against Ukraine is ongoing. Right now, they even didn't do that. So some people say that the war's some kind of statement instead of no statement at all. That's not a bad thing. For instance, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, says that But for us in Ukraine, well, of course we're unfortunate. I mean, we think it's unfortunate that you don't mention who's attacking who's fighting, who's actually suffering, and so on, because the war is on Ukraine's land. So when you say that because of this war, people are suffering, why don't you add, like, where? You know, what kind of people? They have a name, you know, starts with U, Ukrainians. All right, so we're not happy about it, but we're not necessarily, you know, losing our sleep over it. What matters is supply of weapons to Ukraine for us to continue our offensive to liberate our occupied lands, and financial assistance from other sources as well to keep our economy afloat, so people would get their basic salaries, social payments, and so on.
Indeed, and for that supply of weapons to continue, you just mentioned, and the financial assistance, how important it is for the allies such as the United States, the UK, and France, and Germany to carry their people along? In the case of the United States, where today is September 11th, it's the day of 9/11, over 22 years ago, where the United States was bombed by the terrorists, attacked, with the planes by the terrorists, where President Biden is being criticized for not attending, going to New York to the World Trade Center sites to be there personally to attend, and he's over in Alaska. So, and that's part of the, yeah, he's going to be in Alaska in a military,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, so several questions basically in one question. First of all, there have been cases over years since 2001 that the American president was not necessarily physically in New York, but elsewhere. Normally, it would be some site connected to the tragedy of September 11th. So it could be New York, it could be Pentagon near Washington, or it could be Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where one of the planes went down, overtaken by passengers when they fought against terrorists. So normally that'll be the case. So why Biden decided not to do it? Well, if he is with the military and paying respect and maybe saying things to the military, addressing them, and of course his words will be carried around the globe and around the country, and if he is remembering the 9/11 and paying the tribute, that's basically fine. I mean, but the position in the U.S., of course, is a very deeply polarized country right now, very much divided country. So whatever Biden says or does, they will clearly be saying, oh, he is wrong. You know, imagine for a moment he does something otherwise, 180% degrees from what he did, you know, they would still be saying that he's wrong. So in terms of assistance to Ukraine, yes, we do depend, of course, on the will, political will, situation in various countries, the U.S. in particular, because we are getting most of our financial assistance from U.S. If you just compare the countries, even though if you put together all European Union and all EU member countries and count how much assistance they have provided to Ukraine, you'll be surprised. They provided more than the United States, but all of the countries together, taken together, and US is just one country, which is basically the same amount, more or less, of the money that all EU member states give to Ukraine. So if President Trump successful with his nomination and then a general election becomes the president, of course in Ukraine we will worry. We will still hope that he would understand, and people around him, that U.S. interests dictate to U.S. to continue support Ukraine in this war, if at that point of time the war will still be on, which is pretty much, you know, a possibility. Obviously, unfortunately, is shaping up as a protracted, prolonged war. But we worry, you know, and therefore, of course, for right now, we are trying to hope that in whatever countries that are helping out the most, the political forces would continue to be having a consensus on necessity to help Ukraine. And also, what is very important, the public is still very much supportive. We're seeing some trends where people are probably asking and wondering already why we're spending so much on Ukraine, specifically the United States, and some politicians capitalize on this. But that's still not too much of a trend. And we worry in Ukraine, yes, but we don't worry too much. And we hope that for now, for the foreseeable future, we're going to get our assistance coming. And look, there is always something. There's been progress on F-16s. And now we're also hearing that Washington is considering sending us long-awaited missiles of longer distance called ATACMS.
Finally, the counteroffensive and its current position, how much of an impact will the coming winter affect it? We understand there's about 30 days before the winter is fully upon you there in Ukraine. Is this a factor that will affect the counteroffensive and put paid to it for this year?
Yeah, I think it might. I don't think it would actually stop it entirely. I think that we would continue to do slowly the offensive. The way we do it right now, Ukrainian military is very incremental, as you see. It's very slow. It's very painful. It actually costs a lot of lives too, which means that you don't necessarily have a lot of maneuvers. Like you don't have forces moving like tens of kilometers every day. So with this kind of a pace, you can do it in the fall, you can do it in the winter as well. You know, you have a lot of mechanical armor like tanks and carriers, personnel carriers. So they kind of need a stable ground to move. So maybe when the fall comes with their rain, with rains, it's going to be a problem. But once the rains comes through in the winter, you can still continue to do that. And if Ukraine is provided with this longer distance fire, quotation marks as they say, so long distance artillery fire capabilities, then it's a big deal. You know, if we get attacked tomorrow, then the land bridge corridor, so-called, between Crimea and Donbass, which Russians control and worry about it, would be within the vicinity, would be within the range, the strike range available for Ukrainians to strike at any moment. So that it disrupts dramatically the supply of weapons or whatever from Russia to Crimea, for instance, and vice versa. So I'm not necessarily pessimistic. I was never overly optimistic about that offensive. From the get-go, I understood it's going to be very painful, very bloody offensive for Ukraine. It's going to be no big, quick success. But at the same time, I'm not overly pessimistic because I'm seeing our troops slowly but surely moving forward.
We hope for a mild winter in the event, and we hope for an amicable resolution.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Diakuyu, thank you so much, Associate Professor, Department of International Relations, Mechnikov National University, Mr. Vladimir Dubovic, who joined us from Odessa in Ukraine. When we return, Dutch runner-up completes 51-day charity marathon journey from Amsterdam to Kyiv. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine as we turn our attention to the world of business and how it's affected by the conflict in both countries. Our business correspondent Laddie Williams is in the studios to give us an inside skinny on what's happening.
Exactly.
Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
The Bank of Russia says you could potentially hike the key rate at the next meeting.
Yeah.
Why? They've done this before.
Yes, they did.
Why did they want to do it again?
They did hike in August at
Right.
the last meeting, and definitely all eyes still on the central bankers this time. Everyone wants to know what the central bankers are going to do next, because that fight against inflation is still really hot right now globally, and Russia is not insulated from that. We've seen cracks in their labor market at this point, and that's impacting production. The sanctions are also impacting, how they get goods from abroad at this time. So all of that is feeding into the inflation in Russia. So we're expecting this from one of the bank CEOs in Russia. That is expecting that they're going to hike rates at the next meeting, even though most analysts and experts are expecting some kind of pause or maybe, but not a cut at this time. But he's trying to let them know that this time don't dismiss a rate hike in Russia at this point, because there's a lot of, macro issues that they're trying to sort out, and inflation definitely is a really big one at this point. So we're looking forward to the meeting. That's September 15th. We'll know if they're going to raise rates even
Is that
further.
how it affects the man on the street in Russia?
Yeah, so because
purchasing power of the...
Right, because we know the ruble is pressured at this time, and that feeds into inflation. When you have, currency devaluation and inflation rising, prices are really high for products and services right there in Russia. Russia is hosting its 8th Eastern Economic Forum. Yeah. What can we expect? Yeah, so it started yesterday right there in Vladivostok. It's going to be on for about 4 days. It's more about economic cooperation in that axis at this point. That's what the meeting is about. They're expecting top presidents right there, about 7,000 participants, and they're going to cut across about 60, businesses, from energy right there to what's it called? That's trade, investment, energy. They're going to be covering all of that there, because at the end of the day, this is a country that's heavily sanctioned right now, so they need as much allies as possible. We're seeing how There's a price cap on how much oil they're able to sell at this time. And obviously the war has opened our eyes to how much of a big producer, Russia is of major commodities in the global market. But because of the sanctions, that has impacted how they sell, at this time. So this meeting, I was expecting Putin is going to give a speech tomorrow at the meeting. So definitely all eyes and ears will be what comes next.
So this must be what he means by the Global South helping to influence the outcome of the G20 summit. When you have the Eastern countries and where they can obviously host the conference in Russia, it's a good thing for them.
Yeah, it's a good thing for them at this point, and definitely they're trying to get as much allies on their side at this time, and we've seen how at the end of the day the sanctions are really biting at this point, and even though they really tried in evading most of the sanctions, even when it comes to processing payments on the global scene at this point, but they've been able to weather the storm. But at the end of the day, experts still expect that the economy is still going to feel the impact even in going forward, because at the end of the day, geopolitics right now is a major issue, and definitely Russia is feeling the pain at this point.
Indeed. Let's talk about black gold now.
Right.
Oil.
Yeah. Oil.
What's driving the sentiment of the price easing but still remaining about $90 a barrel?
Yeah, so it's like, being dragged at both sides, from supply issues to demand issues at this point. So $90, big jump there, was trading at about the $70 range, for the longest time, last month and a few months before. But now, got that big jump to about $90. All of this coming from, production cuts we've seen from Russia, and Saudi Arabia, and for forward guidance showing that there's still going to be, production cuts going forward. So investors and experts are expecting at some point $100 is going to hit. But we don't know if it's going to hit this year. But at the end of the day, we're seeing that, production cut having an impact and keeping oil above $90. But we saw an ease, it did ease today about 10 cents. That's due to the strengthening dollar. I've seen the dollar now for about 8 weeks. It's been strengthening. It's trading at about 104 points. That's talking about the DXY. That's the dollar against the basket of top currencies in the world. So we've seen that go up from about 101 to about 104 at this point. So that's helping ease prices for oil at this point. And as we always say, if you drive a car, definitely you will be afraid to see oil prices go up at this point, because that will reflect
the domino effect.
Prices. Yeah, that domino effect.
Would you say that OPEC Plus's position right now is working to Russia's advantage?
Yeah, it is working to their advantage at this point, because even though the price cap is on Russian oil at this point, there are reports that they're able to bypass some of these, sanctions on, sending their oil out at this time. So they're able to, find ways to still sell, marginally above that cap of about $60. So even with what's happening with Brent and WTI, we see the disparity there is still quite big. But at the end of the day, they're still able to make, sales. That's talking about Russia. And prices rising, with Brent and WTI, that feeds into euros. So euros will also, climb up too when we see prices of Brent and WTI going up.
Yes, and a lot more to see in the days, and the weeks and the months ahead.
Definitely. I hope oil prices stay maybe at 90. I hope they don't go higher.
You and me both.
Yeah.
Thanks, Laddie.
Thank you.
Laddie Williams, Channel's television business correspondent. Finally on the program, now, a Dutch ultra runner has completed a marathon journey from Amsterdam to Kyiv, raising money towards buying ambulances for use in Ukraine. Boaz Kragtwich, who covered about 2,500 kilometers in 51 days, was joined for the final stage of his run into the center of the Ukrainian capital by around 200 supporters. The 28-year-old Dutch runner says every day of the journey has been a fight, but paid tribute to the Ukrainian soldiers and civilians he'd met on his way through the country. He's raised about 60,000 euros so far, enough to pay for 2 ambulances.
I'm very happy. I'm super proud. It's also a bit unreal because I thought this run was never going to finish. But now I'm standing here after 51 days and there's so many support joining us. So it's incredible. I'm very happy. Every day was a fight. Every day was difficult. Physically and mental. There were a lot of obstacles on the way. But I could prepare for the running part. I could not prepare for what I saw in Ukraine because I'm from a country that lives in peace. So Ukraine part made a big impact on me. We had to stay the nights in the bomb shelters. I spoke to the victims, the soldiers. So I have to say, I think the hardest part of the run was that I saw like the people in Ukraine and the war and how terrible it is.
And that's it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. See you again.